it's
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final day of our Indigenous Education Week speakers. My name is Imidi Bourgeois, and I'm very pleased to see all these beautiful faces here today. We are welcoming our final speaker, and she was invited as part of the GKENDASSAWIN Trail Speaker Series. So we're really grateful to be learning from her today. Before we begin, we need to not only recognize, but we would like to honor the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We would also like to honor the traditional territory of Atikamek Anishinaabeg, on which Laurentian University is situated, the traditional territory of Wanavitay First Nation, on which the city of Greater Sudbury is situated. We would also like to acknowledge any and all treaties and traditional territories on which our viewers are situated today. Now more than ever, it is important to privilege these treaty territories and to honor our relationship to one another and to the land. Today, we are celebrating the GKENDASSAWIN Trail Speaker Series, which was created to empower, motivate, inspire, inform the community of Laurentian University, inclusive of students, faculty, and staff. In 2010, the series was renamed to acknowledge the generous contribution of the RBC Foundation to the construction of our new Indigenous Sharing and Learning Center. The RBC GKENDASSAWIN Trail Speaker Series has the mandate to bring forth awareness and educate societies on the successes, challenges, and ongoing evolution of First Peoples, Métis, and Inuit nations in Canada. The word GKENDASSAWIN translates to mean one who has learned and captures the essence of this series. And Dr. Kim Tallbear certainly represents what we feel in the GKENDASSAWIN Trail Speaker Series. She is an associate professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta and a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and Environment. She is building a research hub in Indigenous science, technology, and society. Tallbear is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promises of Genetic Science, as well as a variety of other sources and books. Her Indigenous STS work recently turned to also address decolonial and Indigenous sexualities. She founded a University of Alberta arts-based research lab and co-produces the sexy storytelling show, TP Confessions, building on lessons of learned with geneticists about how race categories get settled. Tallbear is working on a book that integrates settler colonial commitments to settlement in place, within discipline, and within monogamous state-sanctioned marriages. So she is definitely an expert in all realms, and we're lucky to hear from her today. She is a citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota. So again, thank you very much, Kim, for sharing your time with us. We're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. I didn't know you had that bio. Oh, and by the way, I'm not using a headset, and it sounded okay earlier, right? I can go to that if I need to. I'll just say really briefly too, while a lot of my work for the last probably 18 years has been on thinking about the politics and practice and governance issues related to Indigenous peoples doing genomics or being the subject of genome research. In the last 5 to 7 years, I've shifted as well into thinking about the decolonization of Indigenous sexualities. And in my gut, I knew they were related, but I didn't know in my head yet why. It's become very clear to me in the last year how actually this is just another very similar project, even though it might seem very different to a lot of people. And that in my work around Native American DNA stuff, I've really been critiquing settler colonial notions of what counts as the relations that matter, the relatives that matter, right? Also the inheritance of properties. And in the sexuality stuff, I'm moving into thinking about what relations matter according to a settler colonial framework. Marriage matters, monogamy matters, nuclear family matters. All of that gets imposed as well on Indigenous people in the management of Indigenous lands and bodies. So they're very, very similar projects, even though one at first might not think that they are. And also when you think about the imposition of that bundle of nuclear family, monogamy, and marriage, it's all been about the transfer of property, the inheritance of property between generations, and occupying the land as property, women and children as property of the nuclear family and of the male head of household. So I was shocked at how very much it's kind of a very similar type of project. but kind of different disciplines. Okay, so I'm going to go until I think I'll try to not talk longer than 45 minutes so we have some time for Q&A, or maybe I'll try to, it's 8:37, try to be done by 9:30 so we have some time. That sounds good, Emily, and let me know if I'm not adhering to that. Okay, so since I'm not used to having control of my slides either, this is kind of cool, but I still don't seem to have control of them. Interesting. Oh, never mind. It's just slow. Okay. I don't have any slides particularly on governance, but I'll kind of be talking about that as we go. So maybe I will start out with a couple of definitions, but these definitions are geared towards thinking about the university, not necessarily always the practice of research. And so just keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about three roles that Indigenous peoples have historically had, or four roles that we have historically had in relationship to genome research. And that is as the subjects of research. I like to call that objects sometimes because the way that, well, there wasn't really informed consent in early days, not in the way that we conceive of it now. So the subjects of research, thinking about Indigenous peoples as collaborators in research, and that's really where we've been moving. And I think that's kind of the state of the art in the university, only on to that second role, Indigenous peoples as collaborators, which is good. It's good, but it's not exactly where we want to be. The third role is to think about Indigenous people as scientists. And why is that important? It's important for a lot more reasons than just rainbowing up your laboratory. This is more than about representation. It's about asking fundamentally different questions. It's about innovation in methodology, and it is about enabling Indigenous peoples to better govern science and technology. And then the fourth way is in that governance role. So we live in nation states governed by science, Indigenous nations also governed by science. And I would say when I use the word science, I don't just mean Western science, quote unquote, Indigenous people doing observations, learning through experimentation. Some of that might fall into notions of Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge. Some of it might fall into notions of settler science. But when I use science, I'm including all of that. I'm not necessarily making a hard line between those things. And then the fourth role is governance. So, but I'm going to start out with these definitions because I think these might be helpful, because these words are getting thrown around a lot in the university and in the community when we're thinking about how we do knowledge production with Indigenous people that is more democratic, right? That's more inclusive. That's less colonial. And the word, let's see, for some reason, this is delayed sometimes. And also your faces are in the way. So, okay. So we're going to talk about indigenization and inclusion. And this is kind of the first level of thinking about indigenization in the university. And this is a quote that's coming from Rauna Kokkonen, who's a Sami scholar. And of course, Sami are Indigenous people in Sapmi, which cross-cuts Scandinavia. There's also Sami people in Russia. And Rauna says, conceptually, indigenization represents a move to expand the academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge, to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. And I'll be talking this morning about what some of those transformative ways look like, because that's a little vague. And then I'm also citing this article by Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz. Adam is a Métis professor in my faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and Danielle Lorenz is in the Faculty of Education. And they wrote co-authored an article, I think published in 2018. It says, going through these definitions. And I have found this incredibly helpful. So if you're interested, it's an accessible article that breaks down these definitions and helps you think about what indigenization and decolonization actually look like in pragmatic terms within the university. So very helpful. And so they're starting with that first level. Indigenization is conceived of inclusion, the inclusion face of it is conceived of primarily as a matter of inclusion and access. And by merely including more Indigenous peoples, it's believed that universities can indigenize without substantial structural change. We could take that also to the actual act of doing genome research. If we just include Indigenous people, maybe we can do that without substantial structural change. And again, equity, diversity, and inclusion is good, but that's the first step. That's again, not exactly where we want to be. Okay. So the second part of that definition is we're moving to the next level of reconciliation indigenization. And some of you will be familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation, or TRC, calls to action. That is a good example of what reconciliation indigenization looks like. And so there are calls to action for all sectors of society. I wish I had a list of them in front of me. I need to do that. But they have them for higher education. I'm not sure that they have science set apart. They have medicine set apart, but it's really interesting to think about how you might respond to those within your field. And Gaudry and Lorenz say that this second level, what sets reconciliation indigenization apart from mere inclusion, is an attempt to alter the university structure, including educating Canadian faculty, staff, and students to change how they think about and act toward Indigenous people. So reconciliation isn't really about Indigenous people changing how they act. It's about people who have benefited from colonialism, educating themselves, changing how they think and act toward Indigenous people. So the action here, the impetus to act, is on the part of non-Indigenous people, and not only white people too. I mean, I think that goes without saying. Okay. And then the third level of indigenization is what I would call decolonization. It's what Gaudry and Lorenz talk about as decolonial indigenization. Many of us in Indigenous studies are citing Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's 2012 article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. It's open access on that journal that shown at the bottom of this slide, Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society. Eve Tuck is at the University of Toronto in Oise in the education faculty there. Wayne Yang, I think, is in California. I don't know him, but they've been writing a lot together. And Eve is a native Alaskan and has been in Toronto for a while. It's a fantastic article. And I think about it all the time when I use the word decolonization. Am I using that in a substantive way, not just throwing it around as some buzz term? And they say that decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. This is about land back. And then what does the repatriation of life look like? That's largely what I'm going to be addressing in the rest of this talk, my interpretation, the slice of life that I'm concerned with giving back. Tuck and Yang say decolonization is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. The easy adoption of decolonizing discourse, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools, use decolonizing methods, or decolonize student thinking, turns decolonization into a metaphor. I'll give you an example from my own program of how I think that decolonization has been used as a metaphor. And I don't want to be critical of my colleagues, but I'll bring this up in our summer. We have a summer internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING, that I'll be talking about later on in this talk. A couple of years ago, one of our participants, he's Métis and he's a botanist. He came to and so he's already a postdoc. We have all levels of people in the program, and I'll talk more about that. But he came to our summer workshop, which, and he had like a dress lab coat on. I didn't really know such things existed, but he had he does beadwork. He had a gorgeous beaded medallion on his lab coat, just beautiful. And all the participants were super envious. Everybody's like, I want a cool lab coat like that. And so then they decided to do the next year in one of our other country programs, not in Canada, they decided to do a decolonize your lab coat exercise, because we do some group exercises. That's a really cool exercise, but I don't think that's decolonizing a lab coat, right? I think you might say that's indigenizing a lab coat. I don't know, right? But so think about the way you're using these terms, right? Because they lose meaning. People, we're not all on the same page. So anyway, I don't think decolonizing a lab coat is possible, but I don't know. Maybe somebody will have a more complex notion of what that means. So, okay, repatriation of land and life. Keep that in mind as we go through this talk. Okay, so I'm going to just start. This is very basic history. Any historians of science will think I'm an appalling. I've been called a terrible historiographer, by the way, by a historian before in my book. It's not really my thing, but I draw on other historians of science, and I have, obviously, when you do anthropology of science, you must draw on historians as well. So just a brief overview. We can go back to the 19th century and look at these textbooks, and this was this orange or yellow visual here is from an 1868 textbook that was the state of the science at the time, right? This was not pseudoscience. These were respectable scientists working in respectable universities and institutions. This is kind of this notion of cultural evolution, right? Racial evolution being represented in this textbook visual, where you've got the young chimpanzee represent, you know, at the bottom of the hierarchy. They're set in a hierarchy. You've got using the vernacular of the day, the Negro. If you had, some textbooks would have had the Indian as well in that hierarchy. And then at the top, you've got, I guess that's a Greek statue head as the representation of the civilized white person. Always a man. I mean, and think about it too, those, you know, those little cartoons or visuals that have like evolution. Who's at the end of that evolutionary scale? Is there ever a black child, a brown woman? No, it's always a white guy, right? At the end of the evolutionary scale. That's not necessarily an accident. It might be subconscious now, but there's a reason for that historically, why that white male is represented as the natural, most evolved outcome of evolution. So of that particular set of species. Okay, so this is what's going on in the 19th century. We all recognize that as racial science, right? Fast forward, you've got to the early 20th century, you've got a photograph of a German physical anthropologist measuring the crania of a Tibetan woman. This guy later goes on to advise Nazi scientists in the camps in Germany. If we know our history of 20th century racial science, we know that a bunch of biologists and anthropologists got together in Paris in 1950-51 and came out with the UNESCO race statements, where they said, oh my God, this is what our eugenics helped build, right? Because it's England, it's the US, probably Canada. Canada had eugenics programs as well. Alberta, I guess, had a really big eugenics program. Many of the provinces did. This is what that helped lead to, you know, the horrors of Nazi Germany. So you get a bunch of scientists worldwide who come together and say, no more is race going to be an object of research in science. This is when the term population emerges. We all use population now. There's some historians of science and anthropologists of science who have done some really good close looks at how population continues in bits and pieces to adhere old school racial thinking. Really great stuff to read. Okay, so that's what's going on in the mid-20th century. This kind of stuff happens. Race gets rejected as an object of science, gets replaced with population. It's not only in Germany. So here's an example of pretty racist research that happened in Canada in the 1940s and 50s. Ian Mosby is a historian who published an article a few years ago that highlighted these nutritional experiments that were carried out on Indigenous peoples in northern Manitoba, elders as well, both children in residential schools and elders. Some subjects were clearly starving. The research questions were, this was nutrition research. So the research questions were, I don't have them in front of me, but I've talked about this so much. Was the indolent, inert, there's another terrible term, was the indolent, inert Indian really simply a malnourished subject? So were they like lazy, belligerent, and stupid because they were malnourished? Basically, that was the question. And then the second research question was, might they be aided by better modern nutritional knowledge? Okay, keep in mind, these children are incarcerated in residential schools, which we know due to testimony in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although Indigenous people knew this before that, right? All kinds of abuse happening in these schools. The stealing of children from their families, the undercutting of traditional lifeways, the theft of land. When your food system is cut out from underneath you and suddenly you're impoverished in a settler colonial society, you might be malnourished. And I don't think that's just about some genetic question, right? Or some question about Indigenous biology, which is how these things get represented. And in fact, in much of the, say, for example, diabetes research that's gone on in the last 40 years on Indigenous subjects, there was a big 40-year study at among Pima people in Arizona, Indigenous bodies continue to be portrayed as deviant, as biologically and genetically deviant. When we know that for type 2 diabetes, for example, this is a lifestyle problem, right? So we really need to look at social structures. It's a really good example of how research continues to be colonial by objectifying the Indigenous body as deviant versus looking at the system that produces this kind of response. Okay, so we think that we've recovered from this, right? This is the 21st century or late 20th century. Things got better. This myth of progress, which I give another talk on. I don't like this term progress. I don't like to think about lineal progress and lineal time. I like to think about a web of relations, right? So we don't soothe ourselves with this idea, it'll get better in the future. We're always moving toward progress. And then we don't have to think about the web of relations that we're actually in and acting within right now, where there are immediate ramifications for our actions. So this is an example of Indigenous peoples as subjects. We're still in the subject phase. So even though we think that we're in a more contemporary enlightened time, you've got stuff like this happening. And so this is a lot of the kind of research that's in my book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science. You've got this visual on the left, all right, from Orchid Cellmark. Orchid Cellmark, the truth is in the DNA. That was their tagline. They're marketing genetic ancestry tests and parentage tests to tribal communities to do enrollment or citizenship. I've got a whole chapter on that about the problems with that are not only problems with the science, but they're also problems with who owns the data, who's controlling the samples, who's doing the science, do these scientific companies and the scientists that work for them, because a lot of that science comes out of the academy, gets commercialized in companies that scientists then were starting. Do they have any idea about the histories of tribal citizenship? Do they know anything about the Indian Act? Do they know anything about traditional forms of kinship? Yet they're attempting to come into communities selling their genetic tests as objective solutions to political problems. That's the other thing that some of these people in these companies were saying. We offer an objective solution. There's no objective solution to the problem of citizenship. Citizenship is political all the way down. You can decide you're going to use this set of data or this definition of kinship, but it's always political. And science will not change the fact that citizenship is a political thing, including with Indigenous communities, right? You can use DNA testing to do citizenship in Canada. You can use them to do citizenship in my tribe, the Sistinwaupt and Oyate. So I have critiques of this idea that the truth is in the DNA. What truth is in the DNA and whom does it serve? So part of the problem with the way that this research has happened, as I said, goes back to the science and the way people are sampled. It's not only the representation in flashy ads like this. You've got people, PIs like this scientist who was working with the Genographic Project, which was kind of a different version of the Human Genome Diversity Project that failed, and largely because there was a lot of opposition to it by Indigenous peoples. So scientists have wanted to sample Indigenous people, but who counts as Indigenous? Not our definitions, their definitions, right? And our definitions can be at odds. So Spencer Wells says here, and he's from this glossy, National Geographic research project, but this same kind of stuff happens within respectable academic research projects as well. Traditional people that they want to sample, draw blood from, to look at human diversity and human migration around the world would be living in the same place as their ancestors did centuries ago. Has this guy heard of relocation? They should have been relatively isolated from immigration from surrounding groups who've moved into the region recently. Do you know any Indigenous people in lands now occupied by Canada who haven't been moved around and are isolated from immigration? What are they talking about? I mean, really, They should also retain some of their ancestors' ways of life, which were outlawed. Language was outlawed, children were stolen, religion was outlawed, be it language, marriage patterns, and other cultural attributes. In other words, what we want are Indigenous people. So basically what they want are people that don't really exist, but they're going to go find them as much as they can. So let's find the Indigenous people that look most Indigenous, that are least admixed, that represent the very kind of subject that the settler state attempted to eliminate. So they're basically looking for Indigenous people that are dead. I mean, it's just fascinating. And what I do in this chapter in this book is look at the way this representation, this image of the vanishing Indian, who is, by the way, shown in this ad, The Truth is in the DNA. You may not know this in this audience, but the vanishing Indian is a trope that has been around since the mid-19th century. And historians of native stuff know this. So do historians of science. The native they were always vanishing. They're going to disappear. They're not up to the task of European civilization. They don't have the immune systems they need, right? So we don't need to kill them. They're just going to die from disease because they're not evolved to live in our civilized society. So this trope carries through all the way to the 20th century. It's federal policy in both the US and Canada is laden with this trope of the vanishing Indian. It's the grounding assumption for assimilation policy. It's the grounding assumption for residential schools. You know, we will aid them by helping assimilate them, right? It's already happening, but let's put these programs in place where we can further assimilate them into English, into Christianity, into state-sanctioned marriage, property holding, farming, etc. And so here's Spencer Wells in 2000, 2005, 2007, looking for this lost, vanished Indian that the settler state's been attempting to get rid of for a couple of hundred years. And that's who they're looking to sample. So when they go in and sample Indigenous people for human migrations research, they're looking for the least admixed native possible. Well, if the state has attempted to admix you in the first place, what are you looking for, right? So their definition of this timeless Indian who barely exists is the one guiding their research. And I've also written articles about how that loops back and undercuts our own definitions of what it counts to belong in our communities, because the power that science has. It has so much cultural power. And when a geneticist pronounces who is Indigenous or who's not, it actually really does matter. Okay. So that's all. Those first slides were all about Indigenous peoples being subjects or objects, I would say. Now let's move into Indigenous peoples being scientists, so we can think about how we can do work in genomics that is not relying on those old tropes of the vanishing native, right? That's not simply relying on these retrograde notions of admixture and purity, which continue to inhabit the way that we think about Indigenous bodies and subjects. So this is, have to move you around so I can see my labels here. These are our participants from Sing Canada in the wet lab. And so we have this week-long program. There are other examples out there of Indigenous peoples doing science, but because I'm one of the co-founders of this program, I just know it really well, so we can talk about what we do. So we were founded in 2011 in the US, actually first. Sing. 2016, I think they started Sing Aotearoa, New Zealand. 2018, we founded Sing Canada. And then last year in January, I think it was January 2020, I think it's just been about a year, Sing Australia started. So it's always in the summertime, wherever it is. And we have participants, anywhere from 14 to 22 participants. We found the sweet spot is about 14 to 16, but they come in for a week of, we always have a theme, and I'll get to that in a bit. Each program has a theme every summer, and so we require lab facilities in the university where we take this, and we move around to different universities depending on our theme and depending on what scientists are working there, what kind of specialty they have at those different places. So picture is from, I think this is from last summer, or the summer before last, Sing 2019. We had a chronic wasting disease theme. We had prion scientists working with us because we have a big prion research group at the University of Alberta. And so here are some of our participants in the wet lab there. Yeah, that's the lab coat. That's the really pretty lab coat, and the picture on the right that our participants were so jealous of. Let's see what else. We also have bioinformatics sessions. This is a picture from Sing USA when it was at the University of Illinois. And I go back and forth to, actually, I still, and one of my partners up here who moved from North Carolina to Concordia and Montreal, we go back and forth between Sing USA and Sing Canada. Some of our people from Sing USA, because it's been in operation for almost 10 years, will go down to Australia and New Zealand, work with them so they have a sense of how the program works. We do an exchange of students. So last year we had an Aboriginal student from Australia up here looking at Sing Canada because they were a few months out from doing their first Sing program in Australia. So she had a sense of how it's going. And she was, just to give you a sense of the diversity of participants, she was beginning her PhD at Oxford in genomics this year, but was still a participant in Sing. So we have undergrads, we have grad students, we have postdocs, we even have some new assistant professors, Indigenous people that are science professors who might come in because they've never in their training been able to spend a week with other Indigenous people in their field. Often Indigenous students will say, gosh, I was the only one in my lab, right? I was the only one in this class of 200 people in biology. And so even though we may have people who are much more advanced in their training, they don't need a week-long, session in a lab at the U of A in the summertime, they're those ones that are more advanced in science are getting something else. For our undergrads, they're getting the option to see, is this something I want to do? Do I want to be a researcher? You know, they might meet professors, postdocs, and other people that they could conceive of applying to go to do graduate work with. So there's all kinds of networking as well and socializing that's going on. And also everybody's getting some basic lectures in what decolonization in science looks like, because they probably didn't get that in their scientific training. So that's been really important for our people, no matter where they are. These are just some pictures of the kind of conversations we have throughout the week. We'll have conversations about indigenizing and decolonizing genomics. So on the left-hand side there, I'm sitting there in a panel with scientists. I'm the only non-scientist there. I'm the only anthropologist of science. That's Katrina Klaw on the left, has a lab she works on pharmacogenomics stuff. She just started an assistant professor position at the University of Colorado at Denver. Katrina started with Sing US as a PhD student when she was at the University of Washington. Now she's one of the lead faculty in the US. That's Francine Gachupin from Jemez Pueblo, University of Arizona. They have a cancer genetics research emphasis at Arizona. So when we were at Arizona in 2017 for Sing US, the whole program was focused on cancer genetics. And then over on the right is Nani Garrison, who now works in the Center for Society and Genomics at UCLA. Nani started out, she did a PhD in genetics at Stanford, then retrained in bioethics with Mildred Cho at Stanford. Nani now does mostly bioethics. So what we have seen, and she also started out as a participant in Sing when she was still a PhD student. So what we've seen in Sing USA is non-Indigenous scientists who had worked closely with Indigenous populations decided to found Sing US. I think it's an effort to give back. I was one of the bioethics people, even though I'm not traditionally a bioethicist, but I was one of the people that helped do those lectures. We've seen a transition now from non-Indigenous allies being the science faculty in Sing US and Indigenous people doing the social science to now having Indigenous scientists at the helm of Sing US. We've got the same pattern in Canada. All of our scientists so far that have been at the lead faculty have been non-Indigenous. I'm hoping in 10 years we'll see that transition as well in Canada as more Indigenous people are getting their PhDs and coming out of different programs. But you can see on the right side here how we think about this is Katrina Klaw gave a talk on reclamation of our science and talking about doing education in communities around why Indigenous people are involved in genome science. How do you do ceremony and protocol? Katrina had to deal with this when she outfitted her lab and got it up and going at CU Denver. She wanted to do a ceremony. I don't know what was involved in that. I wasn't there. I'm not Navajo or Diné, but she was thinking a lot with ceremonial people back home about how she does her science in a good way and what that means. They're also thinking about how can we talk, because there are so many Navajo language speakers at Navajo Nation. How do we talk about genomics to people who don't speak English? How do we talk to our elders about this? So she and Nani Garrison are having those conversations at Navajo. And it's great that as Navajo people, who have relatives there and who are trained in the science and in the bioethics, they are exactly the people that should be having those questions. So I think that's really fascinating. I'm excited to see what comes out of that. They also talk about asking different questions, right? We at Sing have, that's so fascinating. I don't know why there's these red spots on my slides. We at Sing have also encouraged we've done publications, and I think I've got a slide at the end on that, so I'll come back to that. But so we're not only doing the summer workshop, eventually we decided to help some of the younger people especially that are on the academic track, get some publications out. And so we think very strategically about what it's like for them to get tenure, what it's like for them to do research. So we have these ELSI discussions. So in the US, it's ethical, legal, social implications. That's the federal language. In Canada, it's GELS, right? It's basically the same thing. I always forget what the GELS acronym stands for, but that's what they're using at Genome Canada, right? And in federal agencies here to talk about the ethics, law, social stuff. And so we also have pretty intensive conversations about what that looks like, both in light of federal laws and also in light of tribal laws. And so one of the things that you're seeing happen now is tribes and First Nations and the language is different in the different countries. So if you hear me use different language, it's because I'm thinking between the US and Canada, where the language is not always the same in terms of what we call groups. But Indigenous communities are also thinking about how to regulate science, how to review scientific projects. And so it's not only federal laws around review and ethics that apply, but it's also increasingly Indigenous communities have their own regulations that scientists have to think about when they're attempting to broker a research agreement. There are also in the US, the Indian Health Service has research review boards. I haven't done a research project in a community in Canada yet, so I'm not as familiar with the kind of multiple research review regulations that are at play, but some of you may have a sense of that. But our students, our participants at SING get a sense of the regulatory side of things as well during that week, and meet people who are decision makers in those areas, so they have contacts that they need as they're thinking about their research going forward. I should say that a lot of our Indigenous participants in SING, even though they're doing science often at the grad level, or they're undergraduate researchers, or they're new professors, they have tended to shy away from working with Indigenous populations. So I've interviewed a lot of scientists, and some of them have said, I prefer to work with a population in a hospital. I don't want to go anywhere near yet working on research questions that involve Indigenous peoples. Yes, I would eventually like to get to that point, but the main reason they stay away from it is because they're worried about extractive research. They're worried about the historically problematic ethics of the way that researchers have approached Indigenous communities, and they don't want to get caught up in that. So that history of bad research practices is actually a barrier to Indigenous people doing science that could potentially help their own communities. So there's a lot at stake in revising those kinds of research practices. It's actually keeping our people out of the kind of science we want them to do. So this is just a map of where SING is right now. So SING Canada, SING US, we have been in conversations about doing a SING Mexico. And I just had a meeting with another SING Canada person last week with people in Chile. They want to do a SING program in Chile. One of the things I worry about, I think it's fantastic to think about doing SING in other Indigenous communities around the world, but language is a barrier. So we haven't necessarily worked in communities where they speak Spanish or where they speak Indigenous languages in other parts of the world. If you don't have a sense of how Indigenous politics work on the ground, and if you don't have a sense of how indigeneity is actually defined, because it's defined differently in different parts of the world. So for example, in the US and Canada, while we would prefer to, or where we might use Indigenous language speaking ability as a marker of indigeneity, many of us do not speak our traditional languages. That is not the case in many other parts of the world, where indigeneity would be closely tied to the ability to speak an Indigenous language. Indigeneity is defined again differently in a place like Scandinavia, where they don't have the same clear-cut history of settler colonialism. How do you talk about being Indigenous in a place where you don't have a clear-cut settler? That's why indigeneity is complicated in African countries and in Asian countries. So I want to be very clear that we as North Americans should not run around the world telling people who counts as an Indigenous person or not. Scientists shouldn't do that, and neither should Indigenous peoples in North America. So this is one of the reasons I've been a little bit hesitant to get involved in establishing SING in other parts of the world. I want to make sure that we have a good sense of the politics on the ground of indigeneity before we do that. Once we have that figured out, yes, I think this would be something great to do in different places. Also, you've got, SING Australian, SING Aotearoa, which is the Maori word for New Zealand. Here's some pictures of SING Canada. We were at SFU in 2018 doing clam and conservation genomics. So again, we went with what the communities were interested in there. There are Indigenous communities on the coast who have clam beds who are really interested. We do field trips out there. So we try to get local Indigenous communities involved, and we try to do a theme that is of interest to them, but that's also where we have the lab capacity at the university to work on that particular topic, and where there are scientists at that university who want to work with us. So we couldn't have pulled off SING 2018 without the scientists at Simon Fraser who were working with us, who offered up their TAs, who offered up their lab space, who were who had relations with community. So those scientists have close relations with Indigenous communities out there who are working on clam and conservation genomics. So that was a great year. You'll notice in that picture on the left from SFU, it's all women, except that there was one young man. That's really interesting. And you may notice that as well in your classes. Indigenous, we have a higher proportion of Indigenous women who are doing higher education. And that's a gendered pattern of colonization. So that was really interesting. SING 2019 was a little bit more gender diverse on the right. That's the chronic wasting disease group at the University of Alberta, including some of our core SING scientists who are non-Indigenous. Okay, so we obviously had to cancel SING for this summer, but instead we're working on an Indigenous Peoples and Pandemics course or unit, a video that we're about to launch. So it gave us an opportunity to think about the pandemic, right? And the history of pandemics in Indigenous communities. And some of you will know that the pandemics really aided colonization. They, smallpox, tuberculosis, so epidemics or pandemics really aided colonization. And so we have a long history of thinking about the role of pandemics in colonization. And this new video and course that we're doing that we're going to launch online soon is dealing with that. So that's what we put some of the money from Genome Canada into this year. They're helping us fund that video series on Indigenous peoples and pandemics. These are just pictures of SING US at the University of Arizona, University of Illinois, University of Washington. I'm not sure where else they've been. I've missed a couple of years. So that one's been going since 2011. So yeah, it says more than 120 participants. It may not sound like a lot, but these people have now gone out into positions. Students have gotten into graduate programs. So we're now seeing a lot more Indigenous presence in genome sciences since 2011 when we started doing this. So there's going to be this kind of snowball effect of having all these new people out there working in different labs and programs across different countries. And this is what our work, so we're getting a lot of interest from across Canada. And so my goal is to do a genome SING Canada in every province and territory in the next 12 years. How we will do that in places where they don't have lab capacity, I'm still really interested in. So we may have these more community-based kinds of projects as we go into more rural areas. But I'm kind of also interested in how do we do small s science, not only big S science, right? So if you can do small s science, you have much more access to thinking about doing community-based science. I'm also kind of interested in exploring questions around getting away from, well, especially coming from the United States. I came up here 5-6 years ago now. Whenever I go to big science meetings that are about diversity and inclusion, and there might be a bunch of brown and black faces in the room, it's still Department of Defense and Department of Energy funding a lot of that work often. How do we do science where we're not so deeply entangled with the military-industrial complex? Really interested in that. And I think SING Canada, there may be a better opportunity for us to think more about that question. One of the things I've noticed moving up here is because Canada's involved in global militarism, no doubt, but it's not the same as being in the US, right? Where the military is so front and center in everything, and militarism is so front and center in terms of science funding. And so I'm wondering if we can focus a little bit more on those more critical questions in SING Canada, maybe more than we could in SING US. And we're also focusing on non-humans. Not only they have more of a focus on human genome questions in the US, we're interested in focusing on the non-human up here more. A lot of times because Indigenous communities up here are very much land-based communities, right? They're really interested in questions that are not always about human genome questions, but they're interested in other species. And so that's one of the things I think we're going to focus on up here. And you'll see that in some of these themes. We were supposed to work on H. pylori and the microbiome this summer in collaboration with public health and med school people. We're putting that off until next summer. We'll see if we can meet. I'm not super hopeful. Simon Fraser's been interested in having us come back and doing a salmon genomics focused SING session. I don't have the other ones on, but we've also had interest from people out in Nova Scotia, Dalhousie in particular, and Genome Atlantic is interested in us maybe coming out there and doing something around focus on epidemiology and intergenerational trauma. That'll be difficult, right? Like the ethics around thinking about intergenerational trauma are going to be really hard. So we're going to have to pay special attention to the ethics of how we do that work during that SING session. The US here, you can see on this slide, has done cancer genomics and personalized medicine at Arizona, pharmacogenomics repatriation at University of Washington, epigenetics, I think they probably, Epigenetics at University of Illinois. So The first few years, we did a lot around human genome diversity research because the founding scientists worked in that field with ancient DNA. But that was only the first few years, and it was really politically touchy, but those were very productive years. As more Indigenous scientists kind of came onto the faculty, we moved more towards this idea of doing themes related to their research and started moving around to different organizations. Here's an example of some of the publications that have happened. So let's see, human biology. We had an article that some of our researchers did on archaeological issues. We had one in science. This is, advancing the ethics of paleogenomics. So we do try to also place articles in Science's Policy Forum and in Nature Communications. And they have these short, like 1,000 to 1,200 word articles that are related to policy and ethics that are very high profile, that our participants work on, as well as scientific articles. And one of the things we do is we have extensive conversations about author order. And who should take the lead under whose mentorship on doing a particular article, right? So the same thing you would do in your lab, because you're attempting to also promote the professional development of our younger participants. And so we're very, very strategic about that. There's also, internal review and mentoring around grant writing and things like that. So this broader SING consortium is not only about this summer workshop, it's also about ongoing professional mentoring that happens so young Indigenous scientists can kind of get their feet under them. Okay. I think I'll stop there and we can go to Q&A, and I'm sure some other things will come up for me on the governance stuff.
That was,
I ended really early. Is that good?
Yeah, that was amazing. We'll let a few minutes for the audience to collect themselves, because you touched on so many really important topics. And I think that in our guests today, we have a good deal of non-Indigenous students and grad students, and I think people just from the community. So it's great for you to the way that you did an overview on decolonization, indigenization, and also the way that you examined indigeneity. And and I find it really interesting that you don't want to go and claim or state what indigeneity means in different parts of the world. And the same with these Indigenous students who are really concerned about going into community. So you see the long-standing history there. Same thing with your whole history piece in the beginning. I think that's really important. And I think that maybe many students in the sciences don't have that opportunity to look at decolonizing science. So thank you for that. I saw one question come up a few times, and people are really curious about concepts around blood memory. And so I think that's probably something you get a decent amount of. I'm wondering if you've explored these concepts, or if you've worked with community, or how do you explain blood memory when you're talking to geneticists, and vice versa? How does that conversation go for you?
Well, blood memory is not a term I use, and I would be interested to know how the person who asked the question actually defines that term, because I don't want to assume I know what they mean by that.
That's a good point. So a few people brought it up.
Did anybody define it?
Not a specific definition, no, but their own personal understanding of, in their own, using oral history to define who they are as a people. But then when you're talking about people moving all over the place, and early anthropology research really thinking that populations were stagnant and not moving around. So I mean, those things all come into play together. And so I think sometimes people think of epigenetics when it comes to blood memory rather than the physical aspect.
So they're thinking about the literal physiological properties of blood. And so I don't use the term because I don't think we all necessarily are on the same page about what it means, and I don't want to. So I think the term was first used actually by, at least as far as I can tell in print, by Scott Momaday, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 68 or something for Housemaid of Dawn. I think he's Kiowa writer from the US. But the word blood memory does get thrown around a lot, and I'm never sure if people mean it symbolically or not. I will say, this is a really good question to debate, actually. My feeling is, and you don't have to agree with me, like I'm open to hear the conversation about it. My feeling is we should be careful when we use that word. What are we talking about? I think there's work by historians as well, and I do look at a lot of this in my book. Blood, the red substance, it's red when it's outside of our body, that has been a powerful substance for people around the world over time. If you think about earlier eras when blood was in our face much more than it is now, when people were regularly out in the middle of a community butchering animals, blood was everywhere. Blood, the monthly blood, when that came, that was about life or not life. If the blood came, there was not new life, right? If it didn't, so blood has been, it's been in our faces as human beings for much longer than we've been separated as we are now, with the way that we've organized our lives and our sewage systems and our food systems. We don't have blood on our hands every day, literally, like our ancestors did. But you can see where it was this incredibly powerful thing. And so this idea that the colonizers simply imposed blood, for example, in blood quantum, that's not the complete truth of it, right? Blood is a powerful substance. It's whose meanings get applied to the way that we live our lives around blood. And so that's why I ask, what do you mean by blood memory? Do you mean it as symbolic? I think a lot of the way that we look at blood now is a very symbolic way of looking at it and not a real material way of looking at it. If we were talking about, and I will probably have these conversations when we do the epidemiology focused summer SING program, blood memory will probably come up, and we'll be able to have an in-depth conversation about whether we should be using that word or not in relationship to the science and how we use it. So I don't know if that was an answer to the question. I don't tend to use the word. Are people talking about, for example, the inheritance of traits? So one of the things that I like to think about, and I'm in conversation with people who are looking at our this notion of the social construction of race goes around a lot. I'm not a hard social constructionist. I'm a biosocial thinker. I think that our biology and social structures are entangled and they shape one another. And our biology, to get back to the epigenetics stuff, I think can get reshaped by social events, right? Yes, so that's true. And then we can see the inheritance of traits because we've had ancestors who have been affected by particular social events. I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure I would be using blood memory in that conversation, but I think we need to figure this out. So.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, you're totally right. It depends where it's coming from. So this was one example where a grandmother had attended residential school and had, denounced a lot of their ways, but those practices still came down through the generations. So it's almost about resilience as well when it comes to going back to your history after those colonial practices. Mm-hmm. But a few people brought that up. So I think it's an interesting conversation and people are really curious around those.
It does come up a lot. Mm-hmm. So I have another example too. I have a student, because there's so much beadworking going on in the academy now, right? And I've got students who are writing very theoretical dissertations, but they're also beadworkers. And what you're starting to see is these previously disconnected practices coming together. So they're actually theorizing how they do beadwork. Why am I choosing this pattern? And if you talk to expert beadworkers, they will tell you, maybe not only experts, they will tell you they are not the only agent constructing the beadwork, that the beads themselves are doing something and they don't know where this is coming from, And so I've heard people say, I'm doing beadwork and patterns or making flowers that my great grandmother made. I didn't know she did that until another relative said, your beadwork looks like your great grandma's beadwork. And then she was talking about the process of the beadwork with her relative. And they said, that's the way your great grandmother talked about it. That's an example of where somebody would use the term blood memory, right? But what does that mean? What does that mean? It's a nice, pretty phrase, a symbolic phrase to talk about it, but we might not even all agree on where we think that comes from, right? So I know it's a term that comes up a lot. I think it's really interesting, and I'm not saying don't use it, but we might not all use it in the same way, right? Yeah.
Yeah, very good points. I think we have a question very similar, but not quite. You talked about deviant bodies, and you see that a lot through research. And I'm wondering if, we talk about the thrifty gene sometimes, and you hear that in response to diabetes, for example, saying that this thrifty gene is with all Indigenous people, and it's just it's a helpful mechanism. But is there a way to look at residential schools and, those nutritional experiments and how they relate to something like the thrifty gene, or also, going back to the ideas around deviant bodies, like you said earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be an interesting research question. I mean, have to get some scientists, especially Indigenous scientists, together to talk about it. The ethics around that would be really complicated, right? because this is bringing up a very sensitive issue for people. So sometimes these questions are really interesting, but is it worth the ethical challenges? Do we have the ethical capacity? Do we have the sort of Indigenous capacity in the academy? Do we have the trust with communities to do the research, to ask the questions we want to ask? We don't always have that capacity yet to do that. So it's not only is the question interesting and is it technically doable, is it socially doable? That's a legitimate question. That's not some assault on objectivity. It's a legitimate question. What is socially doable? I mean, think about the history of more powerful scientists studying less powerful subjects. Why is that? Because it's socially doable.
Mm-hmm.
So we do research already with that in mind, but it's just that it's implicit, right? So these are the kinds of conversations we have at SING too. You know, we'd like to do something. Are we currently at the stage where we can do it? If we're not, how do we get there?
Yeah, great point. I have a question from Thomas Merritt, who's a faculty member at Laurentian. So I'll just let you ask your own question, Thomas.
Sure, sorry, I was unmuting. Dr. Tallbear, your point early on about indigenizing and decolonizing, not simply being rainbowing the lab, I think is really well taken. So as an immigrant, as a settler PI, how do I incorporate this into my lab? How do I change the kind of questions that we're asking in science based on being more inclusive?
Well, I mean, I think have you done collaborative projects with communities that you're working on?
So what I have done is try to work with the Indigenous Sharing and Learning Center here to get an idea of what they're interested in. You know, my concern 10 years ago, 12 years ago when I moved here was to not go in with a question and say, this is what I want to ask. So, you know, I'm trying to create a lab that's inclusive, trying to find out what the interests are in the community. And there are a lot of sort of anxiety around that. I don't want to do it wrong. And in some ways it feels like it's easier to not do it than to do it wrong or to risk doing it wrong.
Right.
So, you know, I don't think there's a single path to doing it right, but I really liked that idea of not simply creating a rainbow in the laboratory. Yeah.
I mean, I think we're not at the stage yet where we have enough Indigenous researchers. One of the concerns we have is that even if you do have a young researcher in your lab, it's not their job to help they're too junior, right? They're too junior and too vulnerable to help you set up those kinds of relations. And that's exactly why our participants have stayed away from Indigenous communities. They don't want to be put in that position because they don't feel that they're yet at a stage where they can do that. Like they're not powerful and knowledgeable enough to broker those relationships. It's too dangerous. You know, it is a really good question. And I have told people before, if you can't do it right, don't do it at all. It's not worth going in and doing it wrong. It's not worth it for the community. It's not worth it for your reputation either, right? It's okay to say, I'm not at the stage yet where I can do this work. Maybe I'm only at the stage where I can mentor an Indigenous scientist in the kind of field that I'm working in, but I know they're not getting everything from me. Where else can they get what else they need? So, I mean, I think you have the right questions. I don't necessarily have a magic answer for you, but your questions are good. Those are the right questions, I think. And to be tentative is a good place to be. But you have me thinking now, because I do know we have Indigenous scientists coming into their own. They've got their own lab. They've got a pretty good amount of grant funding. They're brokering interesting research relationships. I wonder if we need to have something. And they're doing this in Australia, actually. Their program is not only for Indigenous participants, it's actually for non-Indigenous scientists to learn how to work better with Indigenous communities. So now I'm thinking, at first I was like, do we really want to be doing that? I'm not sure we want to be doing that. But now I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe SING actually should take a lead and have some sessions for scientists about what we've learned, right? And how they might do that work. And then they would also be getting networks around the world with labs who have been working collaboratively with Indigenous communities, training scientists. So I'm going to bring that back to SING. So I don't have an answer for you, but other people might. And I wonder if we need to foreground that kind of platform.
That's actually a really great answer. And even just saying that it's okay at this point, if maybe the most important thing I can do is mentor a diversity of students without necessarily feeling like I have to be pushing the frontiers of knowledge in that direction, that can be a really big first step.
Yeah, and just saying, I don't know, you know, I mean, you have something to offer those students, but you can't give them everything. They're going to have to go to somebody else to figure out if they want to work in an Indigenous community, how to do that. And then you might learn from them. as they're a part of your growing network, right? So,
Absolutely.
but I will talk to the Singh global leadership about whether we need to be more high profile about the Australian program and maybe have some way to do that in North America as well. So training non-Indigenous scientists about how to do this. Yeah.
And I think that this conversation is a really great step in the right direction, where we're talking about the questions around ethics. And I don't know that there's a dedicated course on our campus looking at the ethics of research with or on Indigenous people in the past, right? So I think it's included in other courses, but that's certainly something we can work on and go in that direction. I have a few questions or comments, and you know, it's maybe linked to blood memory, maybe linked to blood quantum, concepts around whiteness, and you're hearing more and more of this, and there's research around race shifting, where people are claiming indigeneity when they find, you know, they take a 21 or ancestry test and they find out that they have you know, diverse blood. I'm wondering if you can comment on some of the research that's going on these days into, you know, concepts of blood quantum and claiming indigeneity through genetic or that kind of research.
So their question is about the scientific research around that, or the social science research that's critiquing race shifting?
I think it's more so the social science and, you know, even concepts of whiteness. So people say, you know, no one is technically white, but I think there's like the social construct of whiteness versus the genetic side, perhaps, because genetically is not the same thing as the social cultural aspect, but also the aspect of race shifting and claiming indigeneity when you were not necessarily raised in, you know, relation to community or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what comes up in the race shifting literature is, you know, and Daryl LaRue's got a book on this. Cersei Sturm is an anthropologist in the US who has a book on race shifting among would-be Cherokee people. And Daryl LaRue talks a lot about people claiming to be Métis, different definitions of Métis-ness and Cherokee-ness, right? So this is kind of what I was getting at earlier. Whose definition are we going on? Are we going on the definition of Indigenous communities that exist as collective, as visible collectives of Indigenous people? Or are we going on the definition of people who have for centuries lived as white people, right? Whose definition are we going on? And this is why I think it's so critical to not let the genome sciences get away with and it's a lot of it's implicit, it's not explicit. It's not like scientists are running around saying my definition is the right one that you all need to govern by, but because they have such power, their definitions matter whether they want them to or not, right? They're taken up in ways that they're made to matter. So, you know, this focus on lineal biological descent, right? There is a proliferation, or there's an acceptance of this idea of the one drop rule in settler society that doesn't work the same way in Indigenous collectives, you know, among Indigenous peoples. So yeah, it's difficult to have that conversation, right? You know, people want to privilege the definition that they think is scientifically more accurate, but science doesn't have the scientific answer to something is not always the right answer, because questions of who belongs to an Indigenous community, it's not a scientific question. So how can science answer a non-scientific question? It's a political question and it's a cultural question. And sometimes science is all bound up with politics and culture. But in this case, I think I would make the argument that the cultural and political definition is the one that we need to privilege more. I don't know, that's kind of a convoluted answer, but that's what's happening, right? I think Indigenous communities are attempting to privilege their definition of what it is to belong, and that's not the definition of others who want to make claims. And that's where I think the crux of the problem is. So I don't know, sometimes I give a better answer to that question.
I think it's a complicated question, and it was certainly loaded.
My dean, Chris Anderson, is giving a talk at Western on, I think it's next Friday. Western has a sociology series, so it might be at noon or something like that, noon Eastern, or no, is Western Ontario still in the Eastern time zone? I assume so, I don't know, okay. He's going to be talking about that question in depth, if anybody's interested. So the Western sociology series on Friday, the 20th.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass it over to Josephine. She has a question. She's been writing a lot about blood memory and things like that in the comments. I think she has a quick question for you.
Okay.
Hello. First of all, I'm so glad to be able to talk to you about this, actually, because I've noticed that in my community, which is the African community, in particular, my region in the Sahel, that we've seemed to be so invalidated by the white sort of, when I say white, I mean like European descent and the colonists, those people who were taking all the records. Like, it almost seems that they were writing more or less like what they wanted to believe about our people, and not actually like listen to us and write down what it is we were saying about like where we were from, where we belong. And I just wondered if you had any like insight into that, because I see a lot of the same tactics being used in Turtle Island to almost like mislead people, because it's not like a lot of these conversations weren't being held for a very, very long time among ourselves and with non-Indigenous people. And it just always seems to be that they never quite get the right answer, despite us repeating ourselves over and over. So I don't know, that was just a comment that I had. And like I said, I'm so glad we're having this conversation.
The first part of your comment though was, you feel like they're not, I'm sorry, what is not being accurately described?
Like origin and community, like how Indigenous communities identify themselves, our stories, everything that makes, I guess, that's an interesting claim to say that everything that makes us Indigenous, but at least in my community, everything that identifies you as one of us, like knowing the stories and knowing all of this, and all the stories are not just communicated orally, like they are documented sometimes, like, and I understand that the European system of knowledge is more like graphocentric. They want to see records, they want to see things that were written down, but I don't know, it just always seems that they never quite, it's not like they're paying attention to what we're saying. Like, we just keep repeating the same things like over and over again. And as a comment, I just wanted to make that, because it just blows my mind how we can always just be right off the mark.
That's a lot. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, like when you were talking about this, all these thoughts were going through my mind, because I'm like, I know this. Like I've seen this in my community before, and it's so interesting to see it replicated on other Indigenous groups. So I couldn't miss it. I was like, yes, I know what she's talking about.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks. Emily, are you reading or should I be in chat?
There's lots in the chat, so
okay.
A lot of conversation going on as well. Okay. I think I'm going to pass it over to Taima Moke Pickering, and she has a question or comment for you.
Okay.
Tēnā koe, kia ora koe. I'm a Māori who lives in Sudbury. I've been here for 16 winters, and I lived here. I survived.
Congratulations.
I really appreciated your presentation, and I really appreciate the work that goes into setting up networks across Indigenous communities. And what I wanted to just ask of you is, just in a few words, what is the power of setting up those same communities in the Indigenous nations that you've done?
You mean for the nations themselves?
Both for the nations and for the topic and for the people.
I mean, I think we're mainly working with science students or young scientists, and they're the ones that are thinking about how to bring this back into community. Although we do always have a collaboration with local Indigenous communities near the university where we do the program, right? Because we really want Indigenous participation at all levels. So we'll always have usually environmental staff from different Indigenous nations, right? Because they'll have their own environmental staff, right? They'll be involved. Some of their scientists on the ground will be involved. So what we've seen in tribal communities in North America, and I don't know if it's the same in Aotearoa or not, but we have more environmental scientists or people doing like water quality, air quality, soil quality type stuff than we have people working on genomic stuff and so they're involved. Medicine people might be involved, or cultural leaders will be involved. We'll have a cultural activity. But it is our young scientists who are really figuring out what the broader kinds of long-term outcomes and benefits are for their communities. And so that's a longer term project. I think in terms of global Indigenous connections, this has been pretty amazing. When I first started, because I was always very focused on Dakota people, prairie people, where I come from. I'm a prairie person, even though I'm on the prairies of, what's now Canada. It's still a similar type of landscape and a similar culture. And I was kind of suspicious of this term Indigenous and the idea of global indigeneity. And I'm really not suspicious anymore. I think it's important to keep grounded in our own particular languages and landscapes. We are land and water-based peoples. But I also think these global connections are important for lessons of decolonization, to share the techniques of Sing Canada, to share other kinds of program techniques that we've come up with. We can really share lessons that are valuable to one another. And so those networks have been really important. And I think we're seeing that in the way that Sing is flowering and the way that we're greater, like the US is greater resource than we are in Canada. New Zealand has some great resources to do the Sing organization down there. They've been very successful with this program. It's based out of the University of Waikato right now. And so we're benefiting from each other's lessons. We're benefiting from the resources that we can gather in different nation states. And then we're sending our young participants across the world, or we were before COVID, to learn from each other. That's been really important for them too. I think these global exchanges for young Indigenous people particularly, or not even the young ones, just for Indigenous people in general, have been really, really helpful for their own, for doing work back home, for getting new ideas, for getting reaffirmation that they're not alone in the challenges that they've had. So it's been really good for local outcomes to have that kind of global network. So if that was kind of the question. Yeah, you're welcome.
Brilliant. Kia kaha, keep up the great mahi.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for your question, Taima. And I'll just add, I think it's great to see those photos of all those young scientists coming together, and it's exciting and it's inspiring. And the more those photos circulate, the more those young people will see the potential for doing this work as well, right?
I love watching them together, because I don't know what they're talking about half the time because I'm not a scientist, but I love watching them together get all excited about some nerd science thing. I'm like, it's really cool. It's really cool. Plus there's,
Beautiful to see. So we have a question from Kristen. Kristen M., if you're ready.
Yeah, sorry, my mic was giving me grief. So I had a bit of a question, just because living in the US and living in a Western culture, we do hold genetics on a bit of a pedestal, and it can be, of course, very problematic. And so, I do find it interesting because from what I understand, Indigenous people do put a lot of their identity into their tribe, the people they grew up with, the culture they're steeped in, versus focusing on genetics. But when you have people that leave the tribe, we still call them Indigenous outside of the tribe. So obviously there seems to be a bit of a difference sometimes in how people view the tribal identity versus a genetic identity. And so is it something that you guys have discussed and have figured out, or is it still a process of figuring out how, I guess, I mean, I hate to say like quantifying Indigenous, identity, because that sounds wrong, but I grew up with people who did not grow up in a tribe, but were, said that they were Indigenous, that they grew up with Indigenous parents, and they had, some of their culture at home, but they didn't live within a tribe because, the US. And, it's but then you have all these people who are taking all these genetic tests, and they're like, oh, look, I'm like X amount % of, insert tribe they probably never heard of until they took the test. Like, obviously nobody would want to gatekeep culture and identity, but at the same time, like, there are all these people who are suddenly discovering like different aspects of their heritage that aren't what they thought it was, and who want to be more involved. And I'm just, God, I guess there's a question somewhere in here about not appropriating culture, but getting into that, but it's so genetic based, not necessarily tribal based. Like, is there a good way to balance these kinds of identities, in your opinion?
No, the question you're asking actually comes up a lot. So I know what you're asking. And
I'm so
just
glad, because I didn't know what I was asking.
No, I know. Yeah, I want to see if I can find the notes from a dissertation defense I sat in last week, because my grad student, I'm on his committee at the University of Illinois. Shoot, I didn't write anything in those notes because he had a way of talking about this. A race shifter versus, so not everybody's a race shifter, right? And so but it's hard, but when you're privileging non-Indigenous definitions of belonging, it's hard to see the difference between a race shifter and somebody who has the capacity to reconnect. Whether they have that capacity within themselves or whether the community has the capacity to allow them to reconnect. If there's no community in theory, to reconnect to, you might be a race shifter, right? If all you're going on, like take the Elizabeth Warren case, is some probable ancestry, which has been disproven in her genealogical record. There is nothing in the genealogical record that shows her to be descended from an Indigenous people. When they went back and took her DNA test, which we haven't really seen the detailed results of, because of the scientist who did it, he does work in Latin America. The reference samples were in Latin America. We know that Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas are genetically related, so her DNA test showed some probable ancestry somewhere, but with the reference samples coming out of Latin America, there's no way to tie her to a particular people, right? So she cannot, but people took that as saying she wasn't lying about her Cherokee connections. There's nothing that shows that she has any Cherokee connection. What it shows is that she has probable ancestry somewhere in the Americas, right? There are thousands of Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, thousands. Why would you assume that she's connected to Cherokee people when in fact Cherokee people are extensively documented in the historical record? They have a lot of genealogical documents. They're one of the most well documented on paper Indigenous communities in lands now occupied by the United States. So that's to me is a clear case of race shifting. That's not the same as somebody who's the child of somebody taken in the 60s scoop who wants to reconnect. Is there a community you can point to? Now, it's not automatic that you can reconnect. That's difficult work, right? But that's a different scenario than what I would call the race shifting scenario. But those two scenarios get confused a lot. And what we have is a lot of Indigenous people who might have, in theory, the capacity to reconnect with their community, or the community of their ancestors, maybe you want to say, who are worried that they're doing the same thing Elizabeth Warren was doing. That's not the same thing. And we're still working on figuring out the language, I think, to explain that to people. So I think that's your question.
Yeah, pretty much, because I've grown up in a family that it was taboo to discuss this affair that happened a couple generations back. And my family is now trying to, quote unquote, reconnect with that in ways that I feel like aren't quite right, because they're really connecting with their genetic heritage, not a cultural heritage. Yeah. And I've tried to find good ways of distinguishing that to them, but I can't quite find a good way to express it to them. That I don't think there's anything wrong with them wanting to explore it, but I think there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it. And simply saying, oh, I'm, again, like X amount of, said Indigenous blood. I don't feel like most Indigenous people that I've met measure their identity by how much of their genetics belong to Indigenous cultures that have existed here for centuries. So I would be really interested in that paper. I follow you on Twitter, so I'll have to hit you up on Twitter to follow up on this. But
I need to find that term that my student used. Yeah, my student had a really good, concise term. It's not that we never consider biology, right? It's not biology alone. So it's not that biological descent doesn't matter. There are multiple ways to make kin. Gametes can meet and you can have a new human. That's kin. Although eventually you may decide that biological kinship is not something you want if you're, say, disconnecting from an abusive family, right? Some of us do that. But so biology is one way of making kin. I wouldn't say it's always synonymous with kin. But you can also adopt people either legally or ceremonially. You know, one of the reasons I'm so interested in queer theory and queer studies is because queer people, like Indigenous people, have done a pretty good job of emphasizing made kin, right? Because they've often been rejected by their families of origin. So biology is one way to make kin. It's not the only way, and we shouldn't take it to be synonymous with kin. And I think that Indigenous communities hold these very complex sense of what constitutes kin. And yes, privileging a genetic ancestry test alone is going to be looked upon as pretty shady by most Indigenous communities, unless, of course, there's some other capacity there to reconnect, right? If it's too far in the past and all you've got is genetic ancestry, you might not be able to do that, right? You might have to be satisfied with saying, oh, we have that ancestry, but ancestry alone does not make you who you are.
Beautifully said. I really like how you said privileging Indigenous concepts of identity and not always referencing biological or you know, Western ideas of how people identify. So that was a really, really nice way to put it. And I think sometimes people get caught up in phenotype and saying, well, this is how my mom looks or grandma, so obviously this is where the ancestry lies. And I think that can be a really limiting concept as well. And especially when you're, you know, looking at race shifting versus reconnecting, and not for reasons of residential school or scoops, but you know, people who have lived as white Canadians for the last few generations. So what does that mean now for people to go back to those concepts? So lots of great conversations coming out of this.
Yeah, the intersections of race and indigeneity are really complicated, right? Because people want to take us as being a race, but in my family, the grandchildren look white, red, and black. They're all Dakota, they're all Tallbears. So, you know, indigeneity is not a race. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's any more comments or questions from the audience. There's a lot of conversation going on about all kinds of history across the Americas. Mm-hmm. So obviously we're touching on a lot of great points here. So I'm going to open it up if there's any other questions or comments. I had a question about COVID, actually. If you can comment on the Pfizer COVID vaccine study taking place on Navajo Nation. No?
No, but I didn't even know they're doing it at Navajo Nation. So oh, interesting.
Our president's response when people had lost relatives to COVID express apprehension during the Facebook town hall. And I think maybe that's a good question in general, because you hear a lot of things around vaccines, and, you know, when you're talking about decolonizing science, is there enough representation in trials to account for the genetic diversity of Indigenous people in the Americas?
Well, it's one of the arguments for Indigenous people not shying away from science, right? But again, a lot of Indigenous scientists have said, yeah, but until we can do it right, we shouldn't do it. But that's a question, and it's a question that our young scientists have. So if they're doing trials at Navajo Nation has a very rigorous research review board. That's one of the tribes that I think has the capacity to take some of this on. Many, many tribes do not yet. And they've had a real strong head of that research review board who was instrumental in having a research moratorium on genetic research. And I didn't realize it had been lifted, but I know there's also more Navajo geneticists than there are from any other tribe in the United States. So they are the tribe that has the capacity to think about doing this. So that's interesting. I'll look into that. I didn't know that they were. I know they've been hit hard by COVID, very hard. I didn't know they were participating in the trials.
Very, very interesting, because you know, you hear things about anti-vaxxing, but it's a whole different circumstance when you hear of some adverse effects that people are facing in Canada.
Yeah, I would not ever conflate Indigenous people who are skeptical of clinical trials with anti-vaxxers. I would also not conflate Indigenous people with Christian creationists. That's the other conflation that happens all the time. Our critiques are very sophisticated political critiques of the uneven power balance in science. It's not anti-science. We don't like the politics of science as we've been subjected to it, and we should be clear about that. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think those are conversations that we need to keep having, because even in our community, I hear that from some people sometimes, and it's not a full, well-rounded approach, that's for sure. Gender bias point in course is interesting. Why do you think there are so many female scientists coming up? You know, you were talking about women in particular pursuing graduate studies or higher education. Why do you think that is?
Well, you know, there's usually a gender balance towards men, right? In the hard sciences. I think biology is more like 50-50 now. So that's probably part of it, the broader societal dynamics. But in general, across disciplines in the academy, and we see this in both the US and as far as I can tell is in Canada, I don't know about other countries. We have more, well, I think I've seen this in the Pacific too. We have disproportionate numbers of women, Indigenous women accessing higher education. There are gender studies scholars who would have a better sense of those gendered patterns of colonization, but it's definitely something I see at home too. We may have more men accessing positions of power within the tribal community, but it's women that are going out and accessing higher ed at higher levels. And I'm sure that's got to do with the different ways that men and women, and I recognize I'm speaking in a gender binary, but that's what settler colonialism did, right? That men and women have had access to different kinds of opportunities in the settler colonial system. But it's pretty widespread that we have higher representation of women in higher education, and including in the sciences even, where it's usually male dominated. So, but I don't want to get into why. That's a longer question for a gender analyst that I'm not.
Again, a lot to
have anecdotal answers, but
each of these, there's so much that we could go into. I think we have a comment from Josephine again about internalized racism within Indigenous communities.
Hi, yes. And again, I'm peppering you with all these comments because I'm like, okay, yes, I've seen this before. A lot of what you're talking about is familiar to me. But what I find extremely interesting actually is how we've used this system, at least like a lot of informal settings, about belonging, and how when you're actually trying to get back into your community, like someone will see like that you belong, and someone will see that you know the stories and that you are who you are. But there are cases I can think of where I was around people, for example, who are of my Indigenous self, my Indigenous ancestry, but because of my phenotype, like I wasn't immediately accepted by certain individuals, although like the community at large would see me and respect that I was who I was saying I was. But it was like so strange. It was clearly the wrong answer, almost like objectively you would see that, okay, there's something going on here where someone of the same kin or the same Indigenous group didn't want to accept me. And I did have people in the community stand up for me, but I wonder if this is also something that perhaps Amerindigenous people who are from Turtle Island experience when they try to connect with their lands and their people.
Oh, people that are kind of reconnecting and
yes.
that phenotype comes to matter too much in terms of whether they're accepted or not.
Exactly,
yeah,
yes.
I mean, of course, right? There are different ways to read people as authentic. I mean, even when I go home now, because I've been away for so long, my phenotype isn't a problem. But I'm like a clone of my mother, and people know my mother, but there's still
yes.
other ways that they try to suss out my authenticity. Oh, I don't sound, well, yeah, I've been living in the academy for, right? I don't sound like I did 40 years ago when I was a kid. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways, not to say that, but if you're talking about anti-Black racism,
yes, I am.
that's one of the ways in which that authenticity and questions about authenticity can manifest. And so I don't mean to downplay it. That's a fact, right?
Yeah.
Also, if you code as white, that's another way. Not that I'm equating those two things, but that's another way in which authenticity is questioned.
I've
the way
seen
that
it,
you, right? The way that you talk, the way that the way that you comport yourself. So for sure, these things come up. I think one of the things that gives me heart, though, and we do need to then work through how is race, how is it a lens through which people are gauging authenticity? And I think we need to keep calling that out and be explicit about how that's a problem.
Yes.
But one of the things that gives me heart is the fact that many people at home will still say, well, who's your grandma? Who's your mom? Who's your uncle? Who's your aunt? that's good, because that's how we establish kinship. You know, they want to know how to place you. And it's, well, and once they establish who my mother is, that's not always good, because some people don't like her. So, right. So it might say, they might say, oh yeah, you belong, but oh, I don't like that part of the, I don't like your family. You know, that can happen as well. But I still overall appreciate when people are engaging in our definitions of what belonging is. And that's about who is your family and where do you come from. But yes, that those kind of racial ideas can get in the way of that for sure.
Thank you.
And I think that's why we need to do the work of anti-racism. So that's one other kind of lens that we don't have to deal with, or that we can deal with less, right?
Yes, yes. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Great question. You know, it's always thinking about who claims you as well, right? So you hear some people trying to get in touch or finding a genetic test and seeing that they're not able to reclaim their identity in that way, but is the community claiming you in return? And so I think there is lateral violence within those questions, but you know, I think it's great you touched on authenticity and how people establish what that means to them.
And when we say who claims you, it's not always a good claim. I mean, once people ask all the interrogating questions and figure out who I am, they might have, you know, they still generally acknowledge, oh yeah, you're Sistan Wapton. Doesn't mean they like me. Doesn't mean that they want me to move home. You know, claiming you and being in relation isn't always good and touchy-feely and happy. Relations can be difficult and contentious, and we may decide we don't want those relations because they're too toxic, you know? So when I use the word relations, I always hope that they can be good relations, but not all relations are good relations. They're still relations.
Family. Complex, right?
Yeah.
There's a question about Sing, and specifically if you work with Indigenous communities in Asia. So I know you mentioned that that is one of the areas that can be tricky.
Yeah, we're not yet. We're not yet. Yeah.
So is that around questions of letting local communities identify themselves and progress?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my Indigenous, global Indigenous connections are through also the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which is very much social science and humanities. The only people there from Asia that are coming to an Indigenous Studies conference are Ainu people from the north of Japan and people from Taiwan right now. Where I've done a little bit of reading. Indigeneity works better among, I think, Ainu, but still, you know, settler colonialism is cut and dry in the same way. We haven't yet had, I can't think of any other participation from anywhere else in Asia. I mean, I know in China, they don't use the term indigenous, or it's probably contentious. They talk about national minorities. When I've been in China and I've been around those situations where there's national minorities, to me, it looks like indigeneity, but you know, I don't speak the language there. I don't work in communities in China. I'm not going to be making pronouncements on indigeneity there, that's for sure. So it's really hard to think about how to work in those places unless you speak the language or one of the languages there, and you've been working on the ground a long time, and that's just not the case for many Indigenous studies scholars in the kind of former British Commonwealth countries who largely operate in English. But what was the question beyond? Yeah, so I'm interested, and especially because I go to Tokyo, and I have done a visiting professor gig for 4 years in Tokyo. In an American Studies program at Meiji University, and I circulate with Japanese scholars of American Studies, but they're not Indigenous, they're not Ainu. And I have been asked to get involved in some Ainu-led things, and I'm a little nervous about it. I'm interested, but I just don't know the politics enough of indigeneity in Japan, and I don't want to get involved in something that I'm not yet up to, I don't yet have the capacity to deal with.
Sign of a good researcher, I think.
Yeah.
Right? I'm wondering, so if we want to be more involved with Sing, and if we want to start establishing these kinds of networks, how does Laurentian step in that direction to increase that kind of content on our campus?
To be more involved in Sing? Well, I mean, certainly sending your students to apply to the Sing program once we get going again. As we've met researchers from different universities, they get interested in maybe hosting a Sing, which Sing isn't that expensive. I mean, we've done it on a shoestring budget. I think it costs us $75,000 to do the first year. It's not that, because we pay for everything, all flights, hotels, all food, because we want complete accessibility for Indigenous community members. And, you know, and for the scientists, it's about making their lab space available, classroom space, lab supplies, TAs, that kind of thing, and then spending their week with us. That's the biggest contribution, right? It's not only in the lab, but we have talking circles, we have mentoring dinners. It's a big commitment. It's a whole week of your summer. So, and then what theme, you know, might be helpful. And then I think for the scientists that get involved, because right now they're mostly non-Indigenous, it's an opportunity for them to meet Indigenous students and, you know, maybe recruit students. So yeah, though I'm certainly, you know, we're open to talking about what a theme might look like where you are. I don't think we've got a program in the works for anywhere in Ontario yet. We've got people in Quebec interested at Dalhousie in Nova Scotia. We've talked with some people in Saskatchewan. We'll see what happens. The topic there I'm really interested in, but it would be ethically very sensitive. I'm interested in doing something around HIV immunology, and the ethics of Indigenous communities around HIV are very sensitive. So again, an example of a program I would love to do, but are we there yet? I don't think we yet have the relations to do that work yet. So.
Genetics in local plants could be a very interesting topic for SING.
Yeah, totally. And we have a young plant guy who's Métis working with us who'd be really interested in helping set something up like that. I agree. Great. And it would be different in different parts of the country, right? How fascinating.
Yeah.
Maybe that's an example. I don't know. You know, I'm really interested in the small S, and that might be more in the territories as well, and not the provinces, right? The small S kind of science stuff. What can we do at that level?
Great. I think we have one more. Sally, I'm wondering if you want to ask a question on medicine. So I think we got a couple comments at the same time. Small science connecting locality.
Not necessarily a question, but more maybe planting a seed that maybe there could be some relation to medicine and the field of medicine being, I work for the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and we definitely, I think, want to emphasize, not that I think I've heard the term called small s before, but it does, you know, we do definitely look at non-traditional routes of knowledge and emphasizing the importance of connection to community. A lot of great things I'm hearing you talk about. Would love to continue to learn more from you. So thanks for sharing, and much appreciate your knowledge sharing with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, I think if we, you know, if we can find opportunities to do some scientific training and research that doesn't involve so much big money, right? That also makes it more accessible for communities. And, you know, I'm not Pollyanna about it, but I do think where the opportunities exist, we might want to think about it. And that's one of the strategies for us thinking about, you know, I've only been in major cities in Canada or driven across the South, right? I don't know what it's like to try to do a SING program, say, you know, in Nunavut. How would we do that? I don't know. I'm interested. So that's why I'm thinking about the little s stuff, right? Making this more accessible. Not totally to the exclusion.
And getting everyone involved in actually building partnerships from the ground up, I think. So maybe that's something that we're going to look at as one of those smaller universities and working on a lot of the things that you discussed today. I think we're going to wrap it up, but I really want to thank you for taking time to talk to us. We've been wanting to have you on campus for a long time. So in that way, COVID was kind of a good opportunity to be able to actually see you and hear from you. So we're really pleased to have learned from you today. And if you have a few last words before we finish up.
Oh, just thanks for having me and for everybody that's participating, and good luck to everyone in your work. And I always appreciate, it's been a great audience. Yes, and I get some of these questions, I get a lot, but I really appreciate your engagement. So thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Dr. Kim Tallbear, for your talk today, and thank you to the audience for participating. This video will be available on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, so keep an eye out and share with your friends. Thank you very much, and thanks for wrapping up our Indigenous Education Week in such a great talk.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.